Hey guys, tonight we embark on a thrilling tale of adventure, danger, and resilience, the story of female pirates after their capture. Picture this: the salty sea breeze against your face, the creak of a wooden ship beneath your feet, the sound of waves crashing against the hull. It's the 18th century and you're aboard a pirate ship. A world where lawlessness reigns, and women take on the same ruthless roles as their male counterparts. But what happened to these women once they were captured? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. You probably won't survive this unless, of course, you're as cunning and resourceful as these notorious women were. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The pirate life, how glamorous it seems from the outside, right? The treasures, the freedom, the wildness, but the reality was far different, especially for women. They didn't exactly live the high life. Instead, they faced a daily struggle just to survive on those rickety, overcrowded ships. Many joined pirate crews out of sheer necessity, often escaping from poverty or abusive situations, sometimes even fleeing their pasts. The allure of the open sea was hard to resist. Women were a rarity, but not an anomaly. In fact, several infamous female pirates rose to prominence during the so-called Golden Age of piracy, and they're remembered today for their tenacity and bravery. Still, for all the stories of riches and freedom, life on a pirate ship was brutal. The food was rotten, the weather unpredictable, and the violence was constant. Female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were forced to prove themselves among hardened, often brutal men. To survive in this world, you needed more than just a sword. You needed grit. And grit is exactly what they had. But let's back up for a second. You're on board, and things aren't going well. The ship gets captured. What happens then? Historically, the capture of a pirate ship by the British Navy or any pursuing force marked the end of the line for most pirates, and female pirates were no exception. The moment they were captured, women faced a unique set of challenges, while male pirates were often quickly thrown into cells or hanged. Female pirates were often treated differently, sometimes out of pity, but mostly because society simply didn't know how to handle them. In the immediate aftermath, women pirates were thrown into the same grimy, overcrowded prisons as their male counterparts. But how much did the authorities really care? Most of the time, women were treated with a surprising amount of compassion, or maybe it was just confusion. Female pirates didn't fit into the neat little box that society had reserved for women, which was usually confined to the home or the church. They weren't just criminals, they were an anomaly. The authorities didn't know whether to punish them like men, or perhaps to let them off lightly because of their gender. The prison experience for female pirates wasn't just about the time behind bars. It was about surviving in a system that saw them as either exceptions or curiosities. Some women were even offered their freedom in exchange for testimony against their former comrades. This brings us to the trials. The public trials of female pirates were an odd mix of drama and legal uncertainty. They were often subjected to scorn and ridicule, their crimes amplified by their gender. Historians still argue whether the gender bias of the day impacted their sentencing. Many were hanged or sentenced to life in prison, but some walked away, barely scleed, while others vanished into obscurity. What's curious about the fate of female pirates is the silence that surrounds it. After their capture, Most of these women disappeared from the public eye. Some were executed, others imprisoned, and some simply faded into history, their fates unknown. Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read, two of the most famous female pirates, left behind a legacy that only deepens the mystery. Rumors of their escape from prison exist, but their ultimate fates are shrouded in doubt. But what if some of them did escape? Could they have forged new lives? Perhaps even returned to piracy under different names? Some believe Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read managed to escape their fates through a mix of luck and cunning. However, the truth remains unclear, and we are left with the mystery of their disappearance. If they did escape, it would have been a monumental feat of survival, as escaping from a British prison in the 18th century was no easy task. Then there's the rumor that some female pirates found themselves trapped in the world of prostitution. After their capture, was this just a stereotype, or was it a real possibility for women who had nowhere else to turn? Many scholars believe this is one of the most tragic aspects of their story, as women who once ruled the seas now had to turn to their bodies for survival. Still, it's difficult to separate fact from fiction when it comes to these women's lives after capture. Were they truly forced into prostitution, or did some merely choose it as a way to reclaim some agency in a harsh world? Despite the harshness of their lives, there were also stories of redemption. Some female pirates tried to reinvent themselves after their capture. They lived quietly, working as wives and mothers, sometimes even changing their identities altogether. The idea of redemption is appealing, but we can't help but wonder how many of them were truly able to escape their pasts. History has a way of branding people, and for female pirates, their pasts were always there, lurking like the ghost of a former life. Once their stories were told, and their lives reduced to rumors and half-truths, the legends began to spread. The lasting legacy of these women was not just in their piracy, but in the way their captures and trials added to the larger-than-life mythos of piracy itself. Their names, Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shibi, came synonymous with rebellion, freedom, and defiance. But their true fates remain a mystery, left for us to piece together, one fragmented story at a time. Now, as you drift off into your dreams tonight, think about the women who lived and died by the pirate's code, facing challenges few could survive. Theirs was a life defined by the harshness of the seas, the brutality of their captors, and the loneliness of their journey. Yet, somehow, in the face of all this adversity, they remain a symbol of courage and defiance. As you settle into the rhythm of tonight's journey, imagine yourself on the edge of a pirate ship, the sea lapping at the hull as the wind howls above. But let's step back for a moment before the capture, before the trial, before the prison, that pirate life itself. For women, especially, this life was filled with unexpected turns. For those who found themselves drawn to piracy, the life wasn't one of luxury or comfort. It was raw, it was gritty, and at times, it was downright deadly. Pirate ships, despite their romanticized depiction in popular media, were far from glamorous. The crews lived in cramped quarters, often surrounded by rotting food, unwashed bodies, and the constant threat of violence from both enemies and their own shipmates. The daily struggle for survival was evident in every action, from the way pirates fought to secure their food to the way they handled any conflict that arose on board. Women were just another part of this brutal existence, often hiding their gender, sometimes even masquerading as men, but always contributing to the crew in any way they could. Women who chose to live as pirates did so because they had no other. choice, they were outcasts in a world that often saw them as nothing more than chattel. But on the high seas, they were able to carve out their own existence. But why did women choose to live such a life? Historians have long debated what motivated these women to turn to piracy, especially when the perils of this lifestyle were so evident. Some scholars argue that many female pirates had a deep desire for adventure and independence to things that were often denied to women in their societies. Others suggest that these women were fleeing more dire situations, such as poverty, abusive relationships, or even the pressure of societal expectations. But perhaps the truth is somewhere in between. Perhaps for some women, piracy was not a dream, but a desperate escape from the harshness of the world they knew. Whatever the reason, these women weren't mere passengers in the world of piracy. They were active participants who contributed to the very essence of pirate life. Life on board a pirate ship was, of course, far from simple, but it was also an egalitarian system, at least when it came to work and survival. While men and women alike were required to pull their weight in the crew, women often faced additional challenges. One of the most famous women in pirate history, Anne Bonny, was known for her ferocity and fearlessness, traits that earned her a reputation among her male counterparts. She didn't just participate in the plunder, she led it right alongside her fellow pirate, Calico Jack Rackham. Mary Red, another iconic female pirate, shared a similar tale. Both women spent their pirate days disguised as men, blending in seamlessly with their male counterparts. But this was no easy feat. The danger of being found out was ever present, and the consequences for being caught could be disastrous, especially for women. Yet despite the risks, women pirates were surprisingly common during piracy's golden age. Historians still debate whether women pirates were really as prevalent as their male counterparts, or whether they were simply more visible in the historical records because of their rarity. Either way, women like Bonny and Reed had to fight for every bit of their place in the crew, often proving themselves in battle and taking on roles that were typically reserved for men. And the pirates didn't make it easy on them. They had to work hard to earn their respect and to avoid being treated as mere tokens or novelties. But once they gained that respect, they were just as much pirates as any man. Now, we move forward to the inevitable moment, the capture. After all, being a pirate wasn't a permanent gig. It was dangerous, and sooner or later, someone was bound to get caught. The British Navy, in particular, was relentless in its pursuit of pirates. The idea of a female pirate being caught, however, brought a new set of challenges for the captors. How should they treat these women? Were they to be treated as men, or was there some special treatment reserved for women prisoners? The answer wasn't always clear. Sometimes women pirates, once captured, were treated with a strange mixture of pity and suspicion. Some historians argued that this was due to the overwhelming disbelief that a woman would live such a life that had always been associated with men. These women were seen as anomalous freaks of nature, some might say, and because of that, their treatment varied widely. Some were given lighter sentences, others were imprisoned for longer periods. But, for the most part, the treatment of female pirates post-capture was in no way sympathetic. Once caught, they were often forced to endure public humiliation in trials that were designed more to make a spectacle of them than to achieve justice. In a society that didn't understand female pirates, these women were at a severe disadvantage from the moment they were captured. The courtroom became a stage for society's judgment on women who dared to defy the natural order. The trial process itself was harsh for any pirate, but it was even more so for women. Their crimes were often painted as more heinous simply because of their gender. Historians still argue whether gender played a significant role in their trials. Some believe that the sentencing of female pirates was influenced more by their status as women than by their actual crimes. Women who had committed the same crimes as their male counterparts were sometimes given harsher punishments because society couldn't easily reconcile the idea of a woman as a pirate. But despite the cruelty of their fate, there were cases where women pirates managed to gain some form of mercy. In some instances, female pirates were allowed to live, sometimes given reprieves or reduced sentences, usually because of the rarity of their crime. After all, what would a world do with a female pirate? It wasn't just difficult for women to enter the world of piracy, it was just as difficult for them to remain there. And so, the stories of these women often ended in the shadow of the gallows or the prison cells. Their names faded from the public's memory, their tales consigned to myths, legends, and rumors. But not all of these women simply disappeared into obscurity. Some, like Anne Bonny, managed to escape from the very prisons that were supposed to hold them. There are debates about whether Bonny truly escaped or whether she simply managed to avoid being executed by using her connections. Regardless, the idea that these women might have escaped the harsh fate that awaited them became another part of the mystery of their lives. Did Anne Bonny escape to live another life? Did she return to piracy under an assumed name? The lack of answers only adds to the allure of these women's stories. For others, however, there was no escape. They were either executed or simply faded into the background, their tales forgotten in the annals of history. Those who didn't vanish into obscurity often lived in the shadows, their pirate pasts following them wherever they went. Some of these women may have tried to reinvent themselves, finding new lives away from the criminal world they once inhabited. But as the saying goes, you can't outrun your past forever. The stigma of being a pirate was hard to shake, and for many, the idea of redemption was as distant as the shores of the Caribbean. At the end of the day, the story of female pirates is one of survival, of women fighting against the expectations placed upon them, carving out their own lives in a world that constantly sought to repress them. Their stories remind us that piracy wasn't just about treasure and adventure, it was about resilience in the face of impossible odds. So, as you let this history settle into your mind tonight, think about the bravery of these women and the legacy they left behind, whether in history, rumor, or myth. The winds have calmed slightly now, and you're still aboard the same ship. Or perhaps you found yourself aboard a different kind of vessel as we continue through the tides of history. You might be wondering, how did women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read become such legends? What made them stand out in a world where piracy was dominated by men? To truly understand this, we need to take a closer look at their unique rise to power and how they came to be known as the pirate queens of their time. Anne Bonny was born around 1700 in Ireland, raised in a fairly well-off family, but after running away to join a pirate crew, her life took a turn that not many women could even imagine. She wasn't born into piracy like some of her contemporaries, but rather chose it when she became dissatisfied with her life as a well-to-do woman in society. Anne's beauty and fiery personality played a part in her reputation, but it was her ferocity in battle that earned her the respect of the pirate crew. Anne's most famous association was with the infamous pirate Calico Jack Rackham, and together they made quite a pair. But it wasn't just Anne's beauty or her relationship with Calico Jack that made her famous, it was her decision to fight. to lead, and to embrace the pirate lifestyle in a way few women had the courage to do. Mary Read, on the other hand, didn't have the same initial path to piracy, but she ended up in similar circumstances. Born in England, she grew up living under the guise of a boy to receive a larger inheritance left by her deceased brother. Later, Mary also joined Calico Jack's crew, where she met Anne. The two women formed a bond, not just because of their shared life on the seas, but because of their shared status as women in a world dominated by men. Mary, just like Anne, was a fierce fighter, known for her courage and determination. Together, Anne and Mary were the ultimate pirate duo, known for their bravery and their ability to hold their ground on the high seas. Historians still debate how much of their story is real versus legend, but one thing is for sure: these women were formidable, and their stories would live on for centuries. The dynamic between Anne Bonny and Mary Read isn't just about their shared history, it's a symbol of the incredible partnership and strength that female pirates exhibited despite the odds stacked against them. Their relationship wasn't just about survival, it was about breaking the boundaries of what society expected from women and proving that they could fight as fiercely as any man. The two women didn't just survive piracy, they thrived in it. They didn't just follow orders, they took charge. When facing capture, they were bold in their resistance. Anne and Mary weren't just in it for the treasure. They were in it for the freedom, the rebellion, and the sheer thrill of living outside the confines of societal norms. Their fame continued to grow as their exploits became known across the Caribbean and beyond. It wasn't long before they became famous for their daring raids, their cunning strategies, and their courage in the face of overwhelming odds. However, their careers would not last forever. Just as with many pirates, their luck would eventually run out, and the fateful day of their capture would change the course of their lives forever. In 1720, Anne Bonny and Mary Read were captured, along with Calico, Jack Rackham, and the rest of their crew. Their capture was an event that shocked many, especially since these women had managed to carve out a reputation that many thought was reserved for men. When news of their capture spread, it raised questions about how female pirates should be treated. It was easy for the public to dismiss male pirates as criminals, but female pirates presented a new set of challenges. What should happen to them? How should they be punished? Should they be given the same treatment as their male counterparts? Or should society take pity on them because of their gender? Interestingly enough, female pirates were often treated differently than men, and not always in the way you might expect. Society at the time didn't know how to handle women who dared to defy societal expectations so openly. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read became a spectacle, one that highlighted the difficulties women faced in a patriarchal society. The two women were sentenced to death, but there was a twist in their story. While Anne Bonny's fate was never fully sealed, some say she escaped from prison. Others suggest she was released due to pregnancy. Mary Read's story was a bit more tragic. She died in prison of a fever before she could be executed. But the question remains, did Anne Bonny escape? Or did she simply vanish? Historians still argue whether she truly escaped, or whether her disappearance was merely a result of the myth that grew around her. Some believe that she managed to escape from prison, perhaps even returning to piracy under a new name. Others argue that she was freed because of her pregnancy, as was the case with many women of the time. But there's no definitive answer. All we know is that Anne Bonny's story didn't end with the hanging of her fellow pirates. The last known record of her was when she was reported to have escaped from prison. Whether she truly did or not is a mystery that still captivates historians and fans alike. Mary Read, on the other hand, was not so lucky. She died in prison, leaving behind a legacy that would be remembered for years to come. But her death raised another question: what happens to the pirate women who don't escape? For many, death was the ultimate fate, but for others, there was still the possibility of reinvention. Some female pirates, once captured, were forced to live as outcasts, with their pasts haunting them for the rest of their lives. Many were sent to the colonies or forced into prostitution as a means of survival. The sad truth was that, for many female pirates, there was no graceful exit from their past lives. But some did survive, in a way. They faded into obscurity, their names never making it into the annals of history. However, their stories that were passed down by word of mouth continue to captivate us. The legend of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and other female pirates remains alive today. Their legacy isn't just about their time as pirates. It's about how they defied societal expectations and created their own paths in a world that was stacked against them in the years following their capture. Female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read became symbols of rebellion and defiance. They weren't just criminals. They were women who fought for their freedom in the face of overwhelming odds. And though their stories may not have ended the way we would have liked, they left a mark on history that continues to inspire us today. Their legacy is one of strength, of survival, and of fighting back against the norms that sought to define them so. As we float further into this tale, let's remember that the story of Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read wasn't just one of pirates and treasure. It was a story of women who fought for their freedom, who carved out their place in history, and who left behind a legacy that endures to this day. Even in the face of capture and death, they remain icons of courage and rebellion. As the night deepens, you may have settled further into your bed, but there's still much more to uncover from the tales of the notorious female pirates. We've seen the rebellious rise of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, their fearless pursuit of freedom on the high seas. But what happens when they're finally caught? The capture of a pirate is a dangerous and humiliating event for anyone. But for women, the fallout often meant a series of complex challenges that added another layer of difficulty to an already grim situation. After their capture, most pirates faced brutal conditions, but the experience for women was often far more complicated. Picture yourself as Anne Bonny or Mary Read, freshly apprehended and thrown into the hands of the British authorities. You've been fighting for your life, living by a pirate's code, and suddenly you're shackled in a cold, damp prison. The guards are unsure how to treat you, and the courts are filled with judgment. They've never had to deal with someone like you before. Women pirates, those who defied society in such a blatant and public way, were not an everyday occurrence, and many authorities didn't know what to do with them. The first stop for many pirates was a dreaded prison, and female pirates had to face conditions that weren't just cruel but were often gendered in unexpected ways. Prisoners were typically thrown into overcrowded cells, with little to no chance of cleanliness, privacy, or decency. This was a fate that awaited all pirates, regardless of gender, but women often faced extra scrutiny. Prison was an environment that didn't take kindly to the defiance these women represented. They were considered oddities, even in a world where male pirates were already seen as criminals beyond redemption. One might think that, in such circumstances, the British authorities might show mercy after all. Pirates were dangerous criminals, but women were still viewed as the weaker sex. In some cases, women pirates were treated with a certain degree of reluctance or condescension. they weren't hanged immediately like their male counterparts, at least not always. Sometimes they were allowed to live a little longer, perhaps in part because of the belief that their gender would somehow humanize them. Women, historically, were often seen as incapable of committing the same evil deeds as men, making it difficult for authorities to reconcile the reality of a female pirate. While this may sound like a strange twist of fate, it also worked against them. The trial process for female pirates wasn't just about determining their guilt. It was a spectacle. The idea of a woman being a pirate was almost impossible for many to accept, so the trials that followed their capture were often marked by a mixture of disbelief, fascination, and, at times, ridicule. Female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were forced to defend their actions not just as criminals, but as women who had dared to reject the very system that was supposed to protect them. While men could be pirates and fit into the mold of rebellious men challenging authority, women had no such societal framework. As a result, their trials often became an opportunity for society to judge not only their criminal behavior, but also their gender. The result was often a harsher sentence, or at the very least, a public display of punishment. But Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read were no ordinary criminals. Even in the courtroom, they stood out. Anne Bonny was known for her fiery temper and bold personality. When her trial came, she didn't meekly accept her fate. Instead, she acted defiantly, rejecting the societal norms that demanded women be passive and submissive. She made it clear that she would not go down quietly. And what of Mary Read? While she may not have been as outspoken as Anne, she too played a significant role in the trial process. Their cases represented more than just piracy. They were a reflection of the larger battle women were facing at the time for the right to be taken seriously as individuals capable of making their own decisions. While Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read's trials were dramatic, it's important to note that these were not isolated incidents. The fate of female pirates was something that was still being debated by society, and historians continue to argue about how much of gender influenced the way women were treated in these situations. Was their gender used against them in the courtroom, or were they seen as a novelty, deserving of special treatment because they didn't fit the traditional mold of a pirate? It's a question that still remains open to interpretation. Of course, we can't ignore the fact that not all female pirates had the same fate. In some cases, women pirates were released or allowed to return to their lives in some capacity. Anne Bonny's fate, for example, is still shrouded in mystery. After her trial, there are conflicting accounts of what happened to her. Some believe she was released from prison because she was pregnant, while others claim she managed to escape. The story of Anne Bonny's escape, if indeed she did escape, has contributed to the mystique that surrounds her legend. But while her ultimate fate is unclear, her story is a powerful reminder of the difficulty women faced when they dared to break the mold. However, not all female pirates were lucky enough to escape such a fate. For some, the end came swiftly. Mary Read, for instance, died in prison of a fever shortly after her capture. This tragic death highlights the harsh conditions many pirates, especially female pirates, faced once they were caught. Their lives were short, brutal, and often ended far too early. The fact that Mary Read died in such a way, without much ceremony, only deepens the tragedy of her story. For many pirates, their capture marked the beginning of a new chapter in their life, one where survival was no longer guaranteed. But for women like Anne and Mary, the end was often more bitter, more isolating. Yet, for those who did survive the prison experience, the question remained, What would life look like after capture? For some, their lives didn't end in prison or death. There were stories of redemption women who tried to return to a normal life after their pirate days. Some of these women, once freed from prison, tried to rebuild their lives, hiding their past as pirates and attempting to reintegrate into society. But how easy was it for a female pirate to forget her past when society constantly reminded her of her status as an outlaw? The stigma was difficult to shake. Once branded a pirate, always a pirate. And what about those who didn't try to reintegrate into society? Could they have taken on new identities? Could some of these women have started over, choosing a new path far away from the pirate world? Historians still argue whether some of these women were given second chances or if they were forced to live with the weight of their past forever. While some managed to reinvent themselves, many were haunted by the shadow of their pirate history. This brings us back to the larger question: how should we remember these women? As criminals, as rebels, or as icons of defiance? Female pirates left an undeniable legacy, one that resonates even today. Their stories were told, retold, and passed down through the ages. Whether they were executed, escaped, or simply disappeared into the shadows, these women made their mark on history. They were a testament to the power of resistance, and their stories remind us of the many ways women throughout history have fought for their freedom. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of the brave women who defied the odds and lived on the edge of society. Their stories may be shrouded in mystery, but their courage and strength are undeniably real. The wind has shifted now, carrying you further down the path of these untold tales. You've been journeying through the lives of women who dared to live beyond society's boundaries. But now we must turn our focus to something even darker. Once a pirate is caught, the aftermath is inevitable: prison, trial, and sometimes death. But what did these women endure after capture, especially in terms of prison life? How did they fare in a system that wasn't designed to accommodate their existence? And what roles did gender and society play in their treatment? The questions linger, don't they? Were female pirates given a different kind of punishment? Or did their gender actually make them more vulnerable? The reality of imprisonment for female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read was brutal and uncomfortable, especially when you consider that these women weren't just common criminals. They were defiant women who had openly rejected the norms of society. They had lived lives that were seen as rebellious and even outrageous to the eyes of many, and now they found themselves in the cold, dark, and damp prisons, facing a future that was anything but certain. Their fate was in the hands of an unforgiving system that didn't know how to categorize them. For most of these women, the first thing they encountered upon capture was the harshness of the prison system. The women were often thrown into the same prisons as their male counterparts, which, in many ways, was a rough start. While male pirates were usually chained up and thrown into dark cells to rot, female pirates were sometimes treated with confusion or reluctance. But this was not necessarily a better fate after all. Being treated as a curiosity or anomaly didn't mean a better life. There was often no sympathy or understanding, and in some cases, this ignorance led to even harsher conditions. A female pirate might have been seen as a dangerous oddity or a source of fascination, which, while interesting in some ways, only led to further isolation. The conditions in these prisons were appalling: overcrowding, lack of sanitation, food rations, and constant exposure to illness. The average pirate could expect a life of squalor, with little to no hope of redemption. But how were female pirates treated differently, if at all? There is an interesting debate among historians about whether the punishment was more lenient for women because they were seen as weaker or more vulnerable than men. Some suggest that female pirates, once captured, were often offered more leniency due to their gender, or at the very least, they were granted a modicum of mercy. On the other hand, some suggest that women who had been pirates were treated even more harshly because of the fear and disbelief that such women could defy the rules of society so openly. Take Anne Bonny, for instance. Anne's trial was one of the most publicized of her time, and she was even more famous after her capture than she had been during her pirating days. The spectacle of her trial alone demonstrated just how extraordinary her situation was. Here was a woman who had sailed the high seas as a pirate, defying all the rules, and now she was being scrutinized under the harsh eyes of the law. It was clear that Anne had become an object of both fascination and condemnation. But there was one key moment in her trial that many historians agree may have saved her life: her pregnancy. The fact that Anne was pregnant at the time of her trial likely played a role in sparing her from immediate execution, as it was common for pregnant women in prison to be spared from the gallows. But even after the trial, there was uncertainty about her fate. Some believe she was released, while others argue that she escaped her prison cell entirely. Either way, the reality is that her capture and imprisonment didn't follow the same predictable pattern as that of male pirates. The fate of Mary Read was tragically different. She was imprisoned along with Anne Bonny, but unlike Anne, she died of a fever before she could be executed. Read's death serves as a reminder of how unforgiving the prison system was in those days. Illnesses like fevers, caused by poor sanitary conditions and overcrowding, could strike at any time, and many pirates, both men and women, died in prison without ever facing a trial or execution. In Read's case, her death was marked by the bitterness of a life cut short too soon. She died in a foreign land, away from her fellow pirates, and without the chance to escape like Anne. The difference in their fates, the survival of Anne and the tragic death of Mary Read, highlights an important aspect of piracy. While being a pirate may have offered one kind of freedom, it also came with the very real risk of a brutal end, whether by the sword, the gallows, or illness. In fact, the uncertainty of life after capture was one of the greatest challenges that female pirates faced. For those who didn't escape, their lives after capture were filled with the threat of death, isolation, and punishment. But even after the immediate aftermath of their capture, the question remained: what happens to these women after prison? For many female pirates, the possibility of reintegration into society was a distant dream. Once a pirate, always a pirate. Even if they were given a second chance, the stigma of their criminal past often followed them. Society, particularly in the colonies and in Europe, was unforgiving of women who had defied its norms. While male pirates could return to society and blend back in with relative ease, perhaps by taking on new identities or by disappearing into the far corners of the world, female pirates had fewer options. There were some, however, who attempted to reintegrate into society. Some female pirates tried to live out the rest of their lives as common citizens, hiding their pasts and attempting to forget their pirate days. These women, if they were lucky, might have married, had children, and settled down, living out their lives in anonymity. But how easy was it to forget a past like that? How could they forget the thrill, the power, the lawlessness of their time as pirates? And even if they tried to leave their pasts behind, could they ever really be free from the shadow of their criminal history? For many, the answer was no. The societal judgment they faced was constant, and even their most ordinary actions could be scrutinized because of the daring life they once led. For others, there was no Some women, once freed from prison, ended up in places far darker than their days as pirates. Historians have long debated whether some female pirates were forced into prostitution, or whether they willingly turned to this work as a means of survival. The idea that a female pirate might end up as a prostitute after her capture is a sad reality, and many scholars point to this as an unfortunate but likely fate for women who had no other means of support. The pirate world offered them freedom, but once that world was gone, the choices were limited. What remains clear, however, is that female pirates left an indelible mark on history. While their stories may have ended in tragedy, isolation, or obscurity, the very fact that they defied the norms of their time speaks volumes. Their courage, their audacity, and their resilience have inspired countless stories and films. And today, we continue to honor their legacy as pioneers of rebellion and adventure. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, think of Anne, Bonny, Mary Read, and all the other women who dared to take to the seas. Their stories remind us of the lengths people will go to in order to escape the constraints of society. They remind us that sometimes it's the rebels, the outcasts, and the criminals who make history. The darkness of the night surrounds you as you lean into the story, imagining yourself aboard a pirate ship, the salt of the sea mixing with the cool evening breeze. For many pirates, the day of their capture was not the end, it was only the beginning of a new struggle. But for women pirates, the challenges after capture were heightened in ways that we don't often hear about in the grand, adventurous tales of piracy. The story of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the other women who dared to challenge the norms is one of survival, resilience, and the fight for something much larger than treasure. It was about fighting for a place in a world that didn't want to acknowledge them. So far, we've seen the dangers of living a life as a pirate, particularly as a woman, and the difficult paths women like Anne and Mary had to follow to survive, to carve out a space in a male-dominated world. But what about after they were captured? After the trial and the uncertainty of their futures? The idea of how female pirates fared in the prison system is one that has often been overshadowed by the more dramatic elements of their stories. But when we take a deeper look at what happened once they were locked away, it becomes clear that the story didn't just end with the last battle or the prison gates slamming shut, as we mentioned earlier. The conditions of 18th century prisons were terrible. Overcrowding was rampant, disease spread like wildfire, and food was scarce. But for female prisoners, the situation was even more complex. Female prisoners were rare in many of these facilities, and that meant the authorities had no clear systems for dealing with them. Women who had lived lives of rebellion on the high seas were now forced into the confines of prisons, where they had little more than their wits and the will to survive. Their gender was something that often played a critical role in how they were treated, and historians still argue whether women pirates were given more leniency because of their gender, or whether they faced even harsher treatment because they defied traditional gender roles. But despite the harshness of prison life, there were women like Anne Bonny who managed to endure, survive, and, in some cases, escape from these dreadful conditions. While Anne's fate is shrouded in mystery, there are several theories about what happened to her after her trial. Some believe that she was freed due to her pregnancy, which, at the time, often spared women from execution. Others suggest that she managed to escape from prison altogether, a feat that would be impressive given the conditions she faced. The fact that Anne's story is so unclear and full of gaps is a part of the mystique that surrounds her legacy. For those who didn't escape, however, life after capture was far more complicated. Take Mary Read, for example. While she was incarcerated, she fell ill, and tragically, she died in prison of a fever. Unlike Anne, Mary didn't have the luxury of being freed or escaping her fate. Her death was marked by the brutality of prison life and the dangerous conditions that accompanied it. The fact that she died in prison at a young age serves as a grim reminder of just how unforgiving the system could be to those who had lived outside the rules. But not all women pirates met such an untimely end. There are instances of other female pirates who managed to survive in prison or were eventually released. However, the issue of what happened after release is where the true complexity of their lives begins. Many pirates were released after serving some time in prison. But what did they do once they were free? Returning to a normal life was not easy for anyone, but it was especially difficult for women who had once been pirates. Some scholars suggest that many female pirates who were freed after their imprisonment might have gone into hiding, changing their names and identities to avoid the shame and stigma of their pirate past. It's unlikely that many women could simply reintegrate into society, as the weight of their criminal history would have followed them for the rest of their lives. Women like Anne Bonny, whose legend grew even larger after her capture, might have chosen to disappear entirely, starting over in a different place or under a different identity. This, however, is just a theory, one of many in the puzzle that is the legacy of female pirates. Other women, once freed from prison, might have resorted to other means of survival. Historians have long debated whether some female pirates turned to prostitution after their capture, a sad and unfortunate possibility for those who had no other resources or means to support themselves. While it's difficult to know the truth about how many female pirates ended up in such a position, it's clear that for some, there was no way to escape the harsh realities of a world that had little regard for them once they were no longer. Pirates start as the years went by. The stories of female pirates like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read became legends, their names whispered in the corners of taverns and pirate dens. Their daring exploits and their defiance of the societal norms that dictated women's behavior became part of the mythos of piracy. But in the years that followed their capture, they were often forgotten. The harsh reality is that history has a way of erasing the stories of those who don't fit neatly into the narrative of success or heroism. The lives of female pirates became a footnote in the larger history of piracy, overshadowed by the more famous male pirates who became icons, and yet their legacy lives on in a way that is both powerful and poignant. Female pirates like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read may not have changed the world in the way we might expect of larger-than-life historical figures, but their stories have continued to inspire. They were women who defied the rules of society, who lived on their own terms and fought for their freedom, despite the overwhelming odds against them. Even if their lives ended in tragedy, their courage remains an example for generations to come. In some ways, the stories of these women were romanticized, becoming part of the larger mythos of piracy, but the reality of their lives struggling in a world that didn't have a place for them, fighting to survive in conditions that were almost unbearable, was far darker than the legends suggest. They were outcasts, rebels, and warriors who fought against the norms of their time, and their lives are a testament to the strength of women who were willing to take on the world, no matter how impossible it seemed. So, as you lie here tonight, think about the women who dared to live their lives in the most dangerous and unforgiving of worlds. Their stories were written in blood, but they were also written in the resilience of the human spirit. And while their tales may have ended in ways that we can only imagine, they left behind a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. In the world of pirates, women were not just passengers, they were leaders, fighters, and survivors. The moonlight is now soft across the sea, reflecting the quieting waters. The deeper you drift into these pirate tales, the more you feel the weight of the journey these women took. We've seen Anne, Bonnie, and Mary Read, two names forever etched into the history of piracy, but the truth of their stories is one that remains layered in mystery. As we continue, let's look closer at the long-term effects of their lives, how their actions resonated through time, and how they became emblematic of something much greater than just the world of piracy. By now, you've learned that piracy wasn't just a simple life of stealing treasure and engaging in sword fights. It was brutal, taxing, and unforgiving. But for some, like Anne and Mary, piracy wasn't a choice. It was a means of survival. For many, it was about escaping the oppressive societal roles that women were often forced into. While many men turned to piracy as an act of rebellion or for personal gain, female pirates often had far fewer choices. Their stories were not just about defying the odds, they were about surviving the brutal systems that had no place for women who dared to live freely. One of the most profound aspects of the stories of female pirates is how they challenged the concept of womanhood itself. The world of piracy, as harsh and unyielding as it was, presented an escape for these women from the social, political, and economic constraints of their time. By stepping onto pirate ships, women like Anne, Bonnie, and Mary Read rejected the roles they were expected to play: submissive wives, dutiful daughters, and women confined to domesticity. Instead, they embraced the life of freedom, rebellion, and lawlessness. But what happens to those who choose to live outside the conventional roles? For Anne, Bonnie, and Mary Read, the consequences of their choices were grave. Once caught, they faced the same fate as their male counterparts: imprisonment, trial, and even execution. Yet, the historical records surrounding their lives were never consistent. The public seemed unable to categorize them as criminals, and instead, they became a paradox: criminals, yet somehow admirable for their defiance, their survival, and their courage. What makes this even more complicated is the silence that surrounds them after their capture. While male pirates' fates were often sealed with a swift execution or a life in prison, the fate of female pirates was subject to different forces. The authorities were unsure how to deal with women who had defied the very social norms of their time. Were they to be punished more severely for their crimes, or were they to be treated with some measure of compassion because of their gender? This ambiguity meant that the treatment of female pirates was inconsistent, sometimes more lenient, but other times far harsher. Some women were given more time in prison, often because of the hesitation to execute a woman. For those who were not executed, there was still the possibility of being forgotten, erased from the historical record altogether. Anne Bonny's case is one of the most well-known examples of this uncertainty. After her capture, she was sentenced to death, but her execution was postponed due to her pregnancy. Some historians argue that Anne's sentence was eventually reduced because of her condition, while others suggest she might have escaped altogether. The idea that an escaped prison and disappeared has fueled the myth surrounding her, adding a layer of intrigue and mystery to her already legendary status. Could she have lived out her days in secret, free from the consequences of her past? The truth is, we may never know for sure. But this uncertainty itself speaks volumes about how the stories of female pirates were told and retold. shaping their legacies in ways that made it hard to tell where fact ended and myth began. Mary Read's story, however, ended much more tragically. Unlike Anne, she did not escape the harsh realities of imprisonment. She died in prison, a victim of the very system that had sought to punish her for living a life of freedom. Mary's death highlights one of the most poignant aspects of the female pirate experience: how society's punishment was often more severe for women, not just because of their crimes, but because of their very existence as women who defied norms. Mary's death in prison wasn't just a tragic ending. It was a symbol of the system's inability to understand, let alone forgive, a woman who had chosen to live outside the bounds of convention. But let's not forget the larger impact that Anne Bonny and Mary Read had on piracy and history. Their stories might have ended in tragedy, but the legacy of their defiance and rebellion lived on, influencing the way future generations viewed piracy. They became symbols of the freedom and lawlessness that piracy represented, but also of the courage that it took for a woman to step outside the expected norms of her time. Their stories became part of the collective myth of piracy, inspiring countless books, movies, and other forms of media that romanticized the pirate life. In a way, their stories became a vehicle for the broader cultural fascination with piracy. Historians still debate how these women's stories should be viewed today. Are they symbols of empowerment, women who fought against the odds and took control of their destinies? Or are they tragic figures, victims of a society that ultimately destroyed them because they were too much of a challenge to the status quo? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. While their lives were filled with challenges, hardships, and moments of tragedy, they were also moments of profound courage. In a time when women had few opportunities to carve their own path, these women chose to live boldly, risking everything for a life of freedom. And it wasn't just an Bonny and Mary Read. Their story was part of a larger trend in the history of piracy, where women were both rare and remarkable figures. In a world dominated by male pirates, female pirates stood out, not just because of their gender, but because of their unyielding spirit. It was the rebellion against societal norms, the willingness to step into a world where women were not supposed to belong, that made these women unforgettable. Despite the many attempts to erase their names from history, their stories continued to inspire generations of people who were captivated by the allure of piracy. Their stories became part of a larger narrative about freedom, rebellion, and defiance against authority. And though their lives might have ended in defeat, their impact on history was anything but dot. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, let these women's stories echo in your mind. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the countless other women who lived and died on the high seas have been forgotten, abandoned, or erased by time. But their legacy remains alive and well in the myths, the legends, and the stories we tell about pirates. Their courage reminds us that sometimes it takes the boldest acts of defiance to change the course of history. As the night deepens, the sea continues to stretch out in the distance, calm yet vast. The story of female pirates is one that has woven itself into the fabric of pirate history, a tapestry that is as rich and complex as the women who dared to live outside of its bounds. But now we come to an aspect of their lives that is rarely discussed: the silence that followed their capture. When the final chapter was written on these female pirates, what happened next? Were their stories lost forever in the corridors of time, their names erased from history? Did society simply discard them as criminals, leaving their legacies in the dust? Or did their actions ripple out, influencing future generations in ways we may not even realize. The truth is, the fate of female pirates is often a mystery because their stories were either overshadowed by their male counterparts or completely ignored by the historical record. After their capture, most of these women were never heard from again. In some cases, their names faded from the pages of history, becoming little more than footnotes in a larger story. For Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the confusion surrounding their final fates only added to the intrigue and mystery. The silence surrounding them speaks volumes about the gender biases of their time, about the way history has been written, and about how women's voices have often been silenced in the telling of their own stories. Despite the scarcity of records, some historians have managed to piece together glimpses of these women's lives after their capture. Anne Bonny's case, in particular, remains one of the most mysterious and debated stories in the history of piracy. After her trial, it's believed she was imprisoned. And then there are the rumors, those tantalizing tales of her escaping from prison, disappearing into the night. Some accounts suggest she returned to a life of piracy, while others argue that she fled to another place, perhaps to live a quiet life away from the eyes of the authorities. Was Anne Bonny's escape the result of a well-orchestrated plan, or did she simply manage to slip through the cracks, leaving behind nothing but rumors and speculation? This uncertainty only adds to the legend of Anne Bonny, making her one of the most captivating figures in pirate lore. Her defiance in the face of capture and the subsequent mystery of her fate ensured that her story lived on in the hearts and minds of those who loved the myth of the rebellious pirate. But history has not been as kind to Mary Read, whose fate was far less ambiguous. Mary died in prison from a fever, a victim of the brutal conditions she endured. Her death was a tragic end to a life that had been filled with hardship, and it highlighted just how unforgiving the system was to those who dared to live outside the bounds of society. It was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by women who rebelled against the expectations placed upon them. Mary's death also highlights a painful truth, how the harsh realities of life in prison were not just a matter of punishment, but of survival. The conditions in 18th century prisons were horrendous, particularly for women who were often treated as curiosities or outcasts. Even if a woman like Mary Read managed to survive the initial phase of her imprisonment, the constant exposure to disease, hunger, and neglect made survival unlikely. Mary, like so many others, succumbed to the system. Yet, her legacy endures in the tales of her bravery, her ability to fight on the high seas alongside men, and her determination to live life on her own terms. Mary Read's death may have marked the end of her journey, but her spirit lived on, immortalized by the pirates who admired her, and the historians who eventually took note of her existence. But what of the women who didn't end up like or Mary, who weren't as famous or didn't make it into the history books? What of the many unnamed female pirates who sailed under the flag of rebellion, their fates sealed by the same system that sought to erase the stories of the women who defied it? Historians estimate that many women pirates simply disappeared into obscurity, unlike their male counterparts, who often left behind well-documented records of their adventures and later lives. Female pirates were rarely given the same attention. Their stories were often overshadowed by the larger-than-life tales of male pirates, their voices drowned out by the thunderous roars of pirate legends that dominated popular culture. The mystery of what happened to these women raises important questions about how history is written and who gets to tell the stories. For centuries, the voices of women in history have been neglected or erased, and the stories of female pirates are no exception. Why, after all, would society want to glorify women who broke the rules, women who defied societal expectations, fought for their freedom, and lived lives of rebellion? Their stories didn't fit neatly into the narratives of respectability, and so they were often forgotten. But the story of these women, their daring lives, their courageous battles, and their struggles against the tides of societal norms has not been lost. In fact, their stories continue to inspire people today. The modern-day fascination with pirates, with rebellion, and with the idea of living freely is in no small part a result of the enduring legacy of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, even if their names were forgotten by history. Their impact on the world of piracy and beyond cannot be erased. The influence of female pirates is particularly evident in how they've been romanticized in modern times. From movies and books to video games and TV shows, female pirates continue to be portrayed as strong, independent, and fearless women who defy the odds. These portrayals, while often fictionalized, are a reflection of the enduring admiration for women who lived life on their own terms, who fought against the systems that sought to oppress them, and who carved out their own place in a world that had no place for them. But the modern fascination with female pirates isn't just about the adventure or the thrill of piracy. It's about what these women represent: rebellion, defiance, freedom, and the courage to live outside the boundaries of societal expectations. In their time, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the countless other female pirates were seen as outlaws. Today, they are seen as icons of empowerment, as women who fought for their right to live as they saw fit, despite the consequences. Their stories have become a symbol of the strength of women throughout history. Women who refused to be silenced or diminished by the roles society tried to impose upon them. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think of these women, pirates, rebels, and fighters. Think of the defiance that ran through their veins, the courage they exhibited, and the impact they had on the world, even if their names were erased from the pages of history. Their legacy remains, alive in the stories we continue to tell about them, in the inspiration they provide to those who dare to defy the norms and live on their own terms. As the night continues to settle in around you, imagine yourself drifting deeper into the mysterious waters of pirate history. We've explored the lives of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the way they carved their names into the annals of piracy. But now, let's explore something that might seem even more elusive: the unspoken legacies of female pirates. These women, like many rebels before and after them, did not just vanish. No, their stories live on, not in the dry records of historians, but in the cultural myths, the whispers, and the inspirations they sparked. You may have noticed that the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, while dramatic and thrilling, were often recorded in passing as side notes in the greater narrative of piracy. But their influence is undeniable. Female pirates are still among the most compelling figures in pirate lore, partly because their stories have been stripped of the ordinary, making them legends. The uncertainty surrounding their fates has only added to their allure. Their legacies, however, extend far beyond the high seas. They have served as an inspiration for many, not just in the world of piracy, but in the larger story of women's fight for autonomy, freedom, and recognition. Consider the countless depictions of female pirates in modern pop culture, movies, novels, and television shows. Characters like Captain Jack Sparrow's rebellious counterpart, the fierce pirate Anne Bonny portrayed in Pirates of the Caribbean, or the various reimaginings of pirates in fantasy settings, all owe something to the real pirates who lived and died long before. Anne Bonny, along with Mary Read, paved the way for the notion that piracy wasn't just a man's game, and that women could hold their own in the face of adversity. The stories of these women were not just tales of rebellion, they became metaphors for breaking free from oppressive societal norms. Yet, while many of these modern portrayals emphasize the thrill of piracy, the sword fights, the treasure hunts, the freedom there is still a deep underlying truth about these women's experiences that remains unspoken. For all the adventure, the reality of their lives was more complex and more painful. They lived at a time when women's autonomy was not only disregarded, was actively suppressed. In a world where women were expected to adhere to societal expectations of marriage, motherhood, and modesty, these women's choices to live a life of piracy weren't just acts of defiance. They were radical. The very existence of women pirates challenged the foundations of the gender norms that governed their time. But let's return to the part of their stories that's often skipped over: the silence after their capture. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became larger-than-life figures after their capture. Yet, much of their story was absorbed into the collective pirate mythology. The silence surrounding their eventual fates, especially in the years following their capture, left gaps in their story that would later be filled with speculation and rumor. While we know of their trial and some of the events leading to their capture, the lack of concrete records about their final years only feeds into the mythos surrounding their names. Think about how historical records have been shaped by the lens through which they are written. For women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the lack of documentation about their later lives was an effect of a patriarchal society that simply wasn't interested in acknowledging them as anything other than exceptions to the rule. Women pirates were seen as oddities, unusual and almost impossible figures in a male-dominated world. So once they were captured, they were quickly pushed to the periphery of pirate history. In the aftermath of their capture, society moved on focusing on the more conventional and mostly male pirates who continued to shape the history of the seas. But here's the thing about history: it's rarely as simple as the victors telling the story. The myths and legends of these female pirates and Bonny, Mary Read, and others continue to echo in modern times, reminding us of the strength it took for these women to defy the roles society had thrust upon them. While history may have attempted to silence them, the stories of their courage, defiance, and adventures have only grown louder with time. Think about the cultural power of these women. Through the lens of pirate lore, they became symbols of resistance. Pirate lore itself, built on the themes of rebellion and resistance to authority, allowed for these women to be remembered in ways that defied the boundaries of their time, even if they were treated as exceptions, even if they were punished or forgotten in the strictest records of history. The pirate mythos gave them an enduring place. The rebellious women of pirate legend, like Anne and Mary, went on to influence countless generations of rebels, adventurers, and even just ordinary women who fought for their autonomy in a world that wasn't always kind to those who defied the status quo. Let's take a moment to think about the broader cultural influence. Pirate stories, particularly those about female pirates, are not just stories of lawlessness and adventure. They're also stories of survival, of living outside societal structures that didn't cater to the needs of women. These women didn't just go to sea for adventure. They sought autonomy. They sought a life where they didn't have to bow to oppressive expectations. Their lives represented the radical potential of escaping traditional boundaries. It's also worth acknowledging the complexities of their rebellion. Piracy, after all, wasn't just about freedom, was about surviving in a harsh world. The sea itself was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and women who lived on pirate ships had to face not just the weather, but the threats of violence, starvation, and disease. Their rebellion was as much about survival as it was about freedom. In a way, their piracy was a response to the structures that oppressed them, but it also served as an outlet for the rawest kind of self-preservation. The story of female pirates isn't just about them rejecting the norms, it's about them embracing a survivalist, often brutal, life that was far outside the comforts of the world they left behind. Pirates like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read were also part of a much larger network of resistance. Female pirates were not isolated figures. They were part of a global narrative of rebellion that transcended geography and class. As piracy spread across the seas, so too did the idea of breaking free from the rules. The stories of female pirates were never just about individual women, they were about a collective spirit that challenged the dominance of oppressive regimes. When women like Anne and Mary chose piracy, they were making a statement that was both personal and collective. Their actions echoed the larger struggles of those who resisted exploitation, domination, and inequality. But as the years went on, these rebellious women became more than just outlaws. They became icons. Over time, their stories were romanticized, woven into the fabric of pirate lore. Their courage, their defiance, and their boldness became something larger than their lives, something that lived on in the collective imagination. And though history has obscured the details of their final fates, their legacy as pioneering women who defied the odds continues to inspire people today. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let the stories of these women fill your mind. These were women who lived on the edge, who rejected the roles society had given them, and who forged their own paths in a world that sought to silence them. Their stories may be shrouded in mystery, but their impact has never faded. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and all the forgotten women who sailed the seas remind us that sometimes the greatest rebellions are the quietest ones, lived outside the bounds of what society expects. The quiet hum of the evening seems to settle even further, and you can almost feel the waves crashing against the side of the ship as we continue through the journey of these legendary women. Their stories, though often incomplete, are woven into the fabric of pirate history, and now we find ourselves at the crossroads of myth and reality, where the influence of these women continues to leave ripples even centuries later. As we have explored, piracy during the Golden Age wasn't just about treasure and adventure, it was about defying the oppressive systems that sought to control individuals and specifically women. For the few women who sailed as pirates, it was a way to escape the chains of societal expectations, and their actions sent shockwaves through a world that thought it had a clear understanding of gender roles. Women, it seemed, were supposed to be silent, docile, and submissive. Yet, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and others like them, showed that there was far more beneath the surface. Their lives, once filled with blood, sea, and rebellion, became symbols of resistance, symbols that would transcend their deaths and live on for generations. But what really happened to them after their capture? How did their stories end? And what can we learn from their lives? These are the questions that still linger unanswered. Their stories were often interrupted, either through their own mysterious disappearances or through the historical records that buried their fates under the weight of time. Yet, no matter how much we might wish for a clearer picture of their lives, there is an undeniable power in the absence of definitive answers. It's this ambiguity that keeps their stories alive and feeds into their mythologies. For Anne Bonny, there is the well-known, lingering question of whether she escaped from prison. Some historians suggest that she may have been freed due to her pregnancy, while others speculate that she might have faked her own death and disappeared. These theories continue to fuel debates and fuel the sense of intrigue around her. Could she have found a way to live out her life, hidden away in some remote corner of the world, evading both the authorities and the whispers of history? It's a tantalizing thought, and perhaps one of the reasons her legend persists in the modern imagination. Contrast that with the life of Mary Read, whose fate seems far more tragic. Mary died in prison, the victim of a fever that was common in the unsanitary, overcrowded cells of the time. Her death represents a somber end to a life that was anything but conventional. Mary Read had lived an extraordinary life, one marked by her disguise as a man, her work alongside Anne Bonny and Calico Jack Rackham, and her willingness to defy every rule that society had placed before her. But in the end, it was an illness, one that struck many pirates during that period, that took her life. In this, she represents a stark reality. Piracy, though often romanticized, was brutal, unforgiving, and fraught with risks beyond the mere threat of the law. Disease and deprivation were as much a part of the pirate life as the plunder itself. Yet, even as we ponder the fates of these women, we must also remember how they continued to shape the world around them, even after their capture. While the authorities might have locked them away, or worse, their legacies were far from contained. They became part of the fabric of pirate culture, their names and deeds passed down through stories, legends, and songs. But why did their stories survive, when so many others faded away into obscurity? The answer lies in their audacity, the sheer courage it took to live outside the prescribed roles of women in the 18th century. The world they lived in was one where women had little agency, where their lives were dictated by the expectations of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity. For women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, piracy wasn't just an escape, it was an act of rebellion, an assertion of their right to define their own destiny. In that sense, they were pioneers, forging paths that no one had thought to tread before them. They defied the limitations imposed on their gender, and in doing so, they created a lasting legacy that would inspire countless others. Think about the cultural implications of their rebellion. It wasn't just the act of piracy itself that was revolutionary, it was their very presence on the ships. They didn't just steal treasure and fight battles. They fought for a world where they didn't have to answer to anyone. They made their own choices, lived by their own rules, and refused to be silenced. Even when they were caught, their stories didn't end, they lived on, becoming part of the larger story of freedom, resistance, and the desire to escape the constraints of society. In fact, the more we look at their stories, the more we realize how much they have shaped the modern idea of the pirate. While male pirates were often seen as outlaws, rebels against authority, female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read introduced a new dimension to this narrative. They were not just rebels, they were women who defied the rules, who lived freely, in a world that wasn't designed to accommodate them. The mere existence of these women on pirate ships forced society to confront its own limitations when it came to gender. In the end, they became more than just pirates, they became symbols of the fight for equality, for the right to live without being defined by society's narrow expectations. Yet, despite their undeniable impact, it's important to acknowledge that their stories have often been overshadowed by the male-dominated history of piracy. Pirate history as it's traditionally told, has been centered on the exploits of men, while women like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read have become part of the myth. They were still treated as exceptions, anomalies in a world that preferred to focus on the exploits of men. Their stories have often been glossed over, with the focus remaining on the more traditional pirates. This speaks to the larger issue of how women's contributions throughout history have often been overlooked or minimized. Female pirates, like many women throughout history, had to fight to be seen and heard. But, as we've seen, their stories couldn't be fully erased. Despite the historical record's best efforts to silence them, the myth and legend of women pirates continue to captivate and inspire. Their lives have become the stuff of legend, not because of the adventure, treasure, or battles, but because they represent something far more enduring, the unyielding human desire for freedom. And as you continue to think about these women, let their stories remind you of the power of rebellion, the importance of challenging societal norms, and the lasting impact of those who choose to live life on their own terms. Anne, Bonny, Mary Read, and the countless other female pirates may have been marginalized in history, but their legacy continues to shape how we think about freedom, resistance, and the fight for equality. As you rest tonight, think of these women who sailed the seas, defied the rules, and lived life without asking for permission. They may not have written history in the way that some other pirates did, but their story has been written in the hearts and minds of those who continue to remember their courage and defiance. As we continue our journey into the night, let's pause for a moment to reflect on what we've learned and what remains unsaid. We've traveled far from the shores of the past, delving into the lives of women who defied the odds, challenged the norms, and left behind legacies that are still talked about today. But the story of female pirates is more than just the tale of a few remarkable women. It's about understanding how history shapes our view of rebellion, freedom, and survival. While the names of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and other famous female pirates stand out in the vast sea of pirate lore, there were countless other women who sailed the seas, living their lives with the same fierce independence. Many of their stories are lost to time, their names forgotten, but their spirits remain. These women weren't just pirates, they were pioneers, rebels, and survivors, and their lives tell us something important about the fight for autonomy and freedom, not just on the high seas, but in the world at large. As we've seen, piracy was not simply about collecting treasure. It was about living outside the confines of an oppressive system, rejecting the roles that society had set for individuals, and choosing to live by your own rules. For women, especially, piracy was an act of rebellion in its purest form. It wasn't just about escaping societal expectations. It was about forging an entirely new way of life. In the pirate world, women like Anne and Mary had the chance to live without the restrictions of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity the society so often imposed on them. But, of course, this freedom came at a cost. Female pirates lived in a world where survival depended on their ability to fight, to adapt, and to navigate a sea of dangers. Whether it was the constant threat of disease, the risk of being caught by authorities, or the physical dangers of being out on the open ocean, piracy was no easy life. But for women who chose it, it offered a freedom that was rare and precious, freedom to exist outside the boundaries that society had set for them. It was in this world of lawlessness that these women proved that gender was no barrier to power, strength, or leadership. Yet, as history tells us, their stories often ended abruptly and tragically. While male pirates had the opportunity to leave their mark on history, women pirates were often left to fade into obscurity, their legacies either erased or diluted by the passage of time. The contrast between the loud, glorious tales of men like Blackbeard and the silent stories of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read speaks to a larger issue: the way in which history has been shaped and rewritten to prioritize male voices and experiences. Women, even those who had made history through their acts of defiance, were often pushed aside, their contributions minimized or ignored. But the truth is, the women pirates of the Golden Age didn't just exist as footnotes in a larger narrative. They were integral to shaping the culture of piracy itself. They weren't just participating in piracy, they were helping to define it. These women faced unique challenges, and they navigated them with the same cunning, bravery, and audacity as their male counterparts. It's important to remember that their stories were not just about rebellion. They were about survival in a world that wasn't designed for them. And in that world, their contributions were as significant as any man's. One of the most fascinating aspects of the stories of women pirates is the question of how they were treated once they were captured. The varying accounts of Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read's fates demonstrate the complicated and often contradictory attitudes society had toward female pirates. On one hand, the idea of a woman being a pirate was so incongruent with societal norms that it baffled authorities. Women pirates were often seen as anomalies, oddities, in a world where piracy was traditionally a male-dominated activity. This gendered misunderstanding often resulted in a range of reactions from authorities, from disbelief to pity to suspicion. Anne Bonny's trial, for example, was a spectacle. The public couldn't quite reconcile the image of a woman, a beautiful, fiery, and rebellious woman, being a pirate. Her presence in the courtroom was a challenge to the traditional views of women as passive, domestic figures. And though she was sentenced to death, Anne's pregnancy likely saved her from the gallows. There's some debate about whether Anne was released or whether she escaped, but the uncertainty of her fate has only added to the legend surrounding her name. The very mystery of her final years speaks to how history has failed to record the full stories of women like Anne, leaving behind only fragments of their lives to be pieced together through myth and speculation. In contrast, Mary Read's fate was more tragic. After her capture, she was imprisoned alongside Anne Bonny, but she was struck by illness, and it was this illness that ultimately claimed her life. She died in prison, a victim not of the sword, but of the very conditions that defined life in those times. The death of Mary Read, like so many other pirates, serves as a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the shadows of piracy: malnutrition, and the brutal realities of life at sea. It's also a reminder that while piracy offered freedom, it came at the cost of a life lived constantly on the edge. But perhaps the most important lesson we can take from these women's stories is how their actions, their audacity, and their courage continue to inspire us today. In the face of overwhelming odds, Anne Bonny and Mary Read lived lives of rebellion. They fought not just against the authorities, but against the societal expectations that sought to limit them. Their willingness to defy those expectations, to live on their own terms, and to fight for a space in a world that didn't want them there, is a story that transcends time. The legacy of female pirates has been shaped not just by the facts of their lives, but by the stories we tell about them. Even as their lives were silenced by time and history, their rebellious spirits have lived on, inspiring new generations to challenge the norms, to fight for freedom, and to live life with audacity. The more we learn about these women, the more we realize that their rebellion wasn't just about piracy, was about the desire to live life on their own terms. free from the constraints that society tried to impose on them. The myth of the pirate, the daring outlaw, the fearless adventurer, the rebel is one that continues to captivate the world. And though much of the history of piracy is told through the lives of men, it is important to remember the women who fought, bled, and died for that same freedom. Their stories are not just relics of the past. They are powerful reminders of the enduring spirit of rebellion that continues to live in each of us. So, as you rest tonight, let Anne, Bonnie, Mary, Reed, and the countless other female pirates fill your mind. These women, who dared to be more than what society expected of them, remind us that the fight for freedom, for autonomy, and for the right to live on our own terms is never truly over. They fought for a world where they could be themselves, unapologetic and unrestrained. And in doing so, they carved a space for all of us to continue fighting for our own freedom. As the night stretches on, we continue to follow the echoes of those wild waves, reflecting on the resilient spirit of women pirates, whose stories have endured through centuries of shifting tides. We've delved into their lives, their rebellions, and their final moments. But now it's time to reflect on how these women fit into the larger narrative of pirate culture and the societal implications of their choices. What did their rebellion represent beyond their own lives, and how did their actions shape the course of history, both for women and for the world of piracy itself? Female pirates were never just outlaws. They were symbols of something much more profound, a challenge to the limitations placed on them by society. Their very existence in a world dominated by men sent ripples through the rigid structures of gender, class, and power. Pirates, in general, were seen as a rebellion against the established norms of society. But when women became pirates, their rebellion was even more profound. To live a life of piracy was to reject every rule that society had set out for women, to abandon the prescribed roles of wives, mothers, and keepers of the home. Women pirates defied these boundaries, embracing a life of autonomy, strength, and sometimes even leadership, in a world that was not designed to allow them that freedom in many ways. The lives of Anne, Bonnie, Mary Reed, and other female pirates can be seen as an extension of a much broader fight for women's rights, a fight that spans centuries and continues today. The notion of female pirates was far from accepted in the world they lived in. Society expected women to be passive, docile, and obedient, confined to the domestic sphere where they were meant to be subservient. But these women rebelled against this with everything they had, by sailing the high seas, by plundering ships, and by fighting alongside men. They were not just defying authority, they were also defying the very norms of womanhood that had been imposed on them. Their decision to engage in piracy wasn't simply a pursuit of wealth or adventure. It was a rejection of the limited roles available to women. These women sought freedom, autonomy, and, perhaps most importantly, agency. In a time when women's voices were seldom heard and their choices were often restricted, becoming a pirate was a radical act. And it's this radical nature that makes the legacy of female pirates so powerful and so enduring. They were not just part of the pirate culture, they helped define it, but in defying the roles society had set for them. The women who chose piracy often found themselves trapped in a different way. The world of piracy wasn't kind, and even as they lived freely on their own terms, their ultimate fates were often sealed by the same rigid structures they had rejected. Anne, Bonnie, and Mary Reed were caught, tried, and ultimately sent to prison there. Lives as pirates abruptly ended. And yet, the public fascination with them, the mystery surrounding their later years, and the way their stories were immortalized in the myths of piracy, show that their rebellion left an indelible mark on the world. While the system may have tried to erase them from history, it's clear that Anne Bonny and Mary Read didn't fade into obscurity. They became symbols of defiance, first against the roles women were expected to play, and later against the historical records that sought to ignore their existence. Their stories have been passed down, reimagined, and romanticized. They have been turned into the stuff of legend, not because of the treasure they stole, but because of their refusal to fit into the boxes society had created for them. This leaves us with the inevitable question: what did these women mean for the world of piracy? How did they contribute to the larger pirate culture, and how did they shape the way future generations would view piracy, rebellion, and freedom? The truth is that female pirates were part of the very fabric of pirate society. They may have been few in number, but their presence was undeniably influential. They proved that piracy was not just the realm of men, but a space where anyone, regardless of gender, could claim autonomy and escape the confines of social norms. Their very existence expanded the possibilities of pirate culture, making it more inclusive and less defined by traditional roles. Piracy itself was about resistance. Against societal control, it was about rejecting the limitations placed upon individuals by law, class, and authority. The women who chose piracy understood this on a deeper level than many, because their lives had already been constrained by society's expectations. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and others who joined the pirate ranks were already rebelling against the roles society had imposed on them as women. They didn't just choose piracy for the adventure, they chose it because it allowed them to break free from a world that would have otherwise kept them confined. And while piracy has often been romanticized as a life of freedom and adventure, the reality was much harsher. For female pirates, the cost of rebellion was steep. Life on a pirate ship was brutal, the risk of death was constant, and the possibility of capture was ever present. The stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read show just how fragile that freedom was. They lived their lives on the edge, and when they were caught, their rebellion came crashing down. But the reality of their lives, fraught with danger, isolation, and hardship, only adds to the power of their legacy. They weren't just rebels. They were survivors who managed to hold on to their freedom for as long as they could, even in a world that sought to destroy them now. Let's consider the broader legacy of female pirates. The stories of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and others have become an integral part of pirate mythology. They're no longer just women who lived and died in a world of danger and lawlessness. They've become symbols of freedom, defiance, and rebellion. And perhaps most importantly, their stories have opened the door for future generations of women to break free from the constraints placed on them by society. Just as Anne and Mary fought for the right to live on their own terms, today's women continue to fight for the right to define their own futures. It's also important to consider the way these women's stories have evolved. As we look back on their lives, we see that their stories have been retold time and again as cautionary tales, other times as romanticized adventures, and sometimes as feminist icons. The way we tell their stories speaks to the evolving understanding of gender, freedom, and rebellion. Today, we look at their lives with a greater sense of admiration, recognizing that their fight was not just for treasure or fame, but for the very right to exist on their own terms. When we look at their place in history, we must acknowledge that these women weren't just pirates, they were pioneers. They fought against systems that sought to define them, and in doing so, they carved out their own space in the world. Their lives weren't easy, and their fates were often tragic, but their impact cannot be overstated. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and the countless other female pirates who came before and after them represent something much greater than rebellion. They represent the fight for agency, for freedom, and for the right to live authentically in a world that constantly tries to impose limitations on who we are. So, as you prepare to drift off into the quiet, think of these women, of the courage they displayed in the face of adversity, of the lives they led, and of the mark they left on the world. They may have been erased from the historical record, but their rebellion, their spirit, and their fight for freedom live on in the stories we tell. They were not just pirates, they were symbols of resistance, and their legacy continues to inspire generations to come. The sea, calm now under the dark sky, continues to stretch on before us as we navigate through this fascinating journey of rebellion, survival, and the unyielding spirit of women who dared to live beyond the rules. We've learned much about the fierce women pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and while their stories have mostly been lost or distorted over time, their legacy lives on. But what happens when you look beyond the individual tales of these women and examine the greater implications of their lives and their rebellion? What did the existence of female pirates truly represent, and how did their defiance influence the way women are perceived in history and in modern society? Female pirates did not exist in a vacuum. The life they lived, the risks they took, and the rebellion they sparked were a direct challenge to the societal structures that governed their world. And when you think about it, their rebellion was not just about piracy, was about the rejection of a society that demanded women be confined to the roles of wives, mothers, and caregivers. To become a pirate, to live freely on the open seas, was to reject all those expectations, and in rejecting those expectations, these women were making a statement, not just to their contemporaries, but to future generations as well. They were showing the world that women could not be easily defined or boxed into roles that society had set out for them. Their defiance was, in essence, a declaration of autonomy. It's easy to view piracy as a simple matter of treasure and adventure, but for these women, piracy was about so much more. Yes, there was certainly wealth to be had, and there was no shortage of excitement on the high seas. But at the core of their rebellion was a desire for something deeper: freedom. Freedom to choose their own path, to live by their own rules, to escape the constraints placed upon them by a society that saw them as less than equal. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and countless other women who chose the pirate's life were not just running from the law, they were running toward a life of self-determination. They were creating a space where they could live authentically, free from the stifling expectations of their gender and class. And yet, even as they fought for this freedom, they were also constantly faced with the dangers of the world they inhabited. Pirate life was harsh, dangerous, and brutal, particularly for women who had to fight not only against the law, but also against the deep-seated prejudices that permeated society. Being a pirate was not an easy choice for anyone, but for women, it meant navigating a constant threat of violence, not just from enemies at sea, but also from the male-dominated society that would stop at nothing to put them in their place. It meant proving themselves not just in battle, but in every aspect of life on a pirate ship. There were no leniencies given to women pirates, if anything. They had to work harder, fight fiercer, and survive longer than their male counterparts to earn any semblance of respect. But even as women pirates faced these challenges, their very presence on the high seas became a statement in itself. The fact that they existed in a world that didn't seem to have room for them was an act of rebellion They weren't just pirates, they were symbols of defiance. Their actions, their bravery, their very existence challenged the norms and expectations of their time. Their stories, while often incomplete or lost to history, continue to resonate with us today because they speak to something universal. They speak to the desire for freedom, for self-determination, and for the refusal to be constrained by the rules that society sets for you. Think about how their stories have been told over the years. Over time, their actions have been romanticized and dramatized, not just in history books, but also in popular culture. Today, we see them portrayed in films, books, and television shows with a sense of adventure and excitement. But beneath the surface of these portrayals lies something much deeper. The recognition that these women were pioneers. They were not simply pirates. They were icons of resistance, symbols of what it means to live outside the confines of society's expectations. Their stories had become part of the modern mythology of piracy, a mythology that continues to inspire new generations to challenge authority and fight for freedom. The question, however, remains, why have these women's stories resonated so strongly, even as they've been marginalized throughout history? The answer lies in the enduring power of rebellion. Pirates in general have always been seen as rebels, individuals who reject authority, who fight for their right to live outside the law, and who embrace the freedom that comes with rejecting societal constraints. For women, however, this rebellion was even more significant. Female pirates were not just rejecting the authority of the state. They were rejecting the authority of society itself, which told them where they could go, what they could do, and how they could live. By becoming pirates, women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were rejecting everything society had told them about their worth and their place in the world. But even as their stories became romanticized and mythologized, it's important to remember that piracy was not just about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about survival. For Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and for many other female pirates, piracy was about living outside the constraints of a world that had no place for them. It was about survival in a world that was harsh, dangerous, and unforgiving. It was about finding a way to live authentically, even if that meant breaking the law and defying every expectation placed on them. They didn't have the luxury of living a conventional life. Piracy was a desperate choice, born out of necessity and the desire to escape a world that offered them no real options. This is why the stories of female pirates are so powerful. They remind us that sometimes the greatest acts of rebellion are those that come out of necessity. The women who chose piracy were not just adventurers seeking treasure. They were survivors seeking freedom. And in their quest for freedom, they became more than just pirates. They became symbols of resistance, icons of defiance that have inspired generations. The legacy of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and others is not just one of adventure, but one of strength, resilience, and the unyielding desire to live life on their own terms. So, as you continue your journey tonight, let the stories of these women pirates sink into your mind. Let them remind you of the power of rebellion, the strength of survival, and the importance of fighting for the right to define your own life. These women weren't just pirates, they were pioneers, trailblazers, who showed the world that women could live outside the boundaries that society set for them. Their rebellion was not just an act of defiance, it was a declaration of independence. And it is that declaration that continues to inspire us today. As we sail deeper into the night's journey, the weight of these women's stories begins to settle, and we realize just how significant their lives were. The rebellious acts of female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger story about women fighting for freedom and autonomy in a world that was designed to keep them in their place. Their stories are intertwined with themes of survival, resistance, and defiance, and these themes are as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Throughout history, the stories of women have often been erased or minimized, especially when those women stepped outside the boundaries of what was expected of them. Anne, Bonny, Mary, Read, and others like them were among the rare women who refused to conform to the traditional roles assigned to them by society. They defied the roles of wife, mother, and domestic caretaker, and in doing so, they became something more. They became icons of rebellion. Their lives weren't just a rejection of gender roles, they were a rejection of the very notion that women should be subjugated or limited by societal expectations. Think about it for a moment. What would it take for a woman in the 18th century to join a pirate crew? A woman had no rights, no freedoms, and was expected to adhere to strict codes of behavior that kept her confined to the home or the church. Joining a pirate crew wasn't just an act of rebellion, it was an act of survival. It was a way of escaping a world that had no place for these women, a way to carve out their own path in a time when women were not allowed to chart their own course. Piracy, as a profession, offered women the opportunity to live outside the restrictions of society. Pirate crews, though violent and lawless, provided an environment where women could escape the rigid constraints of gender norms, while men ruled the seas with violence and an iron fist. Women could prove themselves just as capable of surviving and thriving in such a harsh world. It's no wonder that female pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read became legendary. They were doing something that women were not supposed to do, and in doing so, they became symbols of something much larger: the desire for freedom, for self-determination, and for the right to live outside of what society told them they could be. But even as they carved out their space in the world of piracy, these women faced challenges that their male counterparts did not. The mere fact of being female made them vulnerable, and the risks they took were compounded by the fact that they were living in a world that had no tolerance for women who defied expectations. Their rebellion was met with scorn, suspicion, and judgment, not just from the authorities, but from society at large. Even as they fought to live free, they were always aware that their actions came with consequences. Every battle, every raid, and every ship they boarded was a step toward a life that could be abruptly cut short by the law, worse. But there's something uniquely empowering about the way they lived. Even in the face of such adversity, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and other female pirates maintained a sense of agency. They fought not just for survival, but for the right to choose their path. Their lives were filled with risk, but that risk was also what gave them power. They chose to live outside the limits of society, and that choice gave them a freedom that many women in their time could never have dreamed of in the modern era. We often look at women who defy convention with admiration, whether it's female leaders, activists, or artists. We celebrate the women who challenge the status quo and fight for their right to live on their own terms. But the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read remind us that this struggle isn't new. These women, and others like them, were some of the earliest pioneers of the fight for women's rights. They may not have been fighting for the vote, for the right to work, or for legal equality in the traditional sense, but their very existence on pirate ships was an act of defiance, a declaration that women could exist freely in spaces that were traditionally reserved for men. The romanticized image of pirates rebel Heroes fighting for freedom and treasure has endured for centuries. But when we look at the stories of women pirates, we see a more nuanced picture. The treasures they sought weren't just gold and jewels, they were the treasure of freedom. The freedom to live life on their own terms. The freedom to choose their own paths. The freedom to fight against the norms that sought to hold them back. And while many of these women's lives ended in tragedy or obscurity, their actions were part of a larger fight for women's autonomy that continues today. Anne Bonny's defiance, Mary Read's courage, and the many unnamed women pirates who followed in their wake were part of a larger story about resistance. Their rebellion was not just against the lot, was against a world that sought to keep them in their place. And in their fight, they paved the way for generations of women to come. Their actions may have been small compared to the grand narratives of history, but they were no less important. They were a part of a movement that sought to redefine what it meant to be a woman in a world that had always tried to limit women's power. These women's stories also highlight the complexities of history. While men who became pirates were often celebrated as heroes, the stories of female pirates were often swept under the rug. They were treated as anomalies, oddities in a world that was not ready for women who dared to step outside the lines. But today, as we look back on their lives, we can see them for what they truly were. Trailblazers. They were rebels, pioneers, and survivors. And they proved that women could break free from the roles society tried to impose on them. It's important to acknowledge that the fight for gender equality is ongoing. Women, throughout history, have fought for the right to live independently and to make their own choices. Anne Bonny and Mary Read may have lived in a world that was harsher and more dangerous, but their defiance and bravery laid the groundwork for the freedoms that women enjoy today. The struggles they faced may have been different from the struggles that women face now, but the fight for freedom and autonomy is still the same. As you prepare for rest tonight, let the story of Bonny and Mary Read remind you that rebellion is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes, the most powerful acts of defiance are those that go against the grain of what society expects. These women were not just pirates, they were symbols of the struggle for freedom, and their stories live on, not just in history, but in the hearts of those who continue to fight for their own right to live authentically. As the story continues, we navigate deeper into the world of these legendary female pirates, uncovering the threads that tie their stories together. In their rebellion, their choices, and their sacrifices, we find reflections of struggles still ongoing today, and in their defiance, we see the power of individual agency and the refusal to accept a world that seeks to limit human potential. The tales of Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and their fellow pirates are not just stories of adventure and freedom, they are stories of survival, resistance, and transformation. Though their names have been romanticized, their lives were far from glamorous. They didn't sail the seas in search of riches for the sake of indulgence. Their piracy was about escaping the constraints of a world that told them they couldn't be more than what society had deemed appropriate for them. These women didn't just fight for treasure. They fought for their freedom, their right to live as they saw fit, and their ability to write their own stories. They weren't just rebels against the authorities at the time, they were rebels against the very notion of what women were allowed to be in the 17th and 18th centuries. And in doing so, they became symbols of courage, independence, and resilience. Their stories are inherently layered with contradictions. They were criminals, yet they were also pioneers. They lived in lawlessness, yet they created their own rules for survival. They defied social expectations, yet their courage and determination have earned them a place in history. Today, as we look back on their lives, we see that the struggles they faced were not unique to piracy. They were struggles that women in all walks of life have encountered throughout history. The challenge of carving out space in a world that is not designed for you. The fight for agency in a society that seeks to define your worth based on your gender. And the pursuit of independence in a world that demands conformity. These are battles that women continue to fight. But let's pause for a moment to think about why their stories, even when lost to time or obscured by myth, continue to resonate so deeply with us. What is it about these women who lived such difficult and often tragic lives that inspires such fascination? Why do their stories, scattered through the pages of history, still capture our imaginations? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very nature of their rebellion. Piracy, as a cultural phenomenon, has always been tied to ideas of freedom and rebellion. Pirates were seen as those who lived outside the law, rejecting the rules of civilization, and carving out their own path. But when women became pirates, it wasn't just a rebellion against the lot, it was a rebellion against the very roles that society had assigned to them. Women pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read showed the world that women could fight alongside men, could survive in a world that had no place for them, and could take ownership of their destiny, no matter how brutal or unforgiving that world might be. This was revolutionary. Their piracy wasn't just a rejection of authority, it was a rejection of the limiting boundaries placed on their gender. And yet, despite the revolutionary nature of their lives, they didn't escape the harsh realities of the world they lived in. As we've seen with Anne and Mary, the moment these women were captured, their fates became uncertain. What happens when a woman, who has spent her life rejecting the constraints of society, is caught and brought before the law? The trials of female pirates were often as much about gender as they were about crime. These women didn't just stand trial for piracy, they stood trial for defying the very norms that defined womanhood at the time. Society struggled to reconcile the image of a woman as a pirate, and in doing so, their trials became spectacles. How could a woman be both a pirate and a woman? How could she be both a criminal and a symbol of resistance? Society wasn't ready for these questions, and so their stories were often clouded in confusion, myth, and mystery. For some women, like Anne Bonny, the mystery only deepened after their capture. Anne's case is one of the most enigmatic in pirate history. Her trial was public, her sentence was postponed due to pregnancy, and then she seemingly disappeared from the historical record. Some accounts suggest that she escaped from prison, while others claim that she was released and simply lived out the rest of her days in secret. The ambiguity of her fate only adds to her allure, creating a legend that continues to captivate people today. The fact that her story was never fully concluded, that there's no definitive answer to her fate, speaks to the way history has handled the lives of women who don't fit neatly into conventional narratives. Anne's escape, whether real or fictional, becomes a metaphor for the elusiveness of female power in history. It represents the desire to break free from the constraints of time and place, and the ability of women to find ways to escape societal limits. In contrast, the fate of Mary Read was more tragic. She died in prison from a fever, a victim not of the sword or the gallows, but of the unsanitary conditions and the diseases that ravaged prison populations. Mary's death serves as a poignant reminder of the brutal reality of piracy, the constant threat of illness, injury, and hardship that accompanied life on the seas. While Anne's story lives on in the mystery of her disappearance, Mary's death underscores the cost of living a life outside the norms. Her life was filled with struggle and defiance, and her death was just another example of the dangers that came with the rebellion she had embraced. However, the influence of women like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read extends far beyond their own time. Their stories have become part of the modern mythos of piracy, often romanticized and dramatized for the entertainment of future generations. But the fact that their stories continue to be told, albeit with elements of fantasy and legends, a testament to their enduring power. These women didn't just inspire the pirates who came after them. They also inspired movements for women's liberation, equality, and self-determination. Their stories have been reframed over time, transforming them from mere criminals into symbols of defiance and strength. Today, female pirates like Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read represent more than just rebellious figures from history. They are symbols of the broader fight for gender equality and autonomy. The battles they fought were not just about treasure or revenge. They were about asserting control over their own lives, rejecting the roles that society had assigned to them, and challenging the limitations that had been imposed on their gender. Their lives may have been short and filled with hardships, but their defiance against the norms of their time laid the groundwork for future generations of women to fight for their own freedoms. As we close this chapter and reflect on the legacies of these remarkable women, think about the struggles that continue today. The fight for freedom, equality, and autonomy is ongoing. Just as Anne, Bonny, and Mary Read defied the rules of their time, women today continue to challenge the structures that limit their potential. Their stories remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, rebellion is not only possible, it is necessary. And in that rebellion, we find the seeds of change that continue to shape the world for generations to come.